In simple terms, for Karl Marx, there are two main classes in society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The two classes are defined by their relationship to the means of production. So you might be asking yourself, well, what are the means of production? This is what Marx has to say there. If we examine the whole process from the point of view of its result, the product, it is plain that both the instruments and the subject of labor are means of production, and that the labor itself is productive labor. So the means of production are anything that is used to create products. So think of capital and labor and property and all of the raw material inputs into a product and so forth. Also keep in mind that Marx is writing in the latter half of the 19th century. So this is industrial revolution. So think of factories and the raw materials that go into creating all of the outputs of the factory, etc. So those are all means of production. Also, labor is a means of production as well. So the bourgeoisie own the means of production as their private property. This is key for understanding Marx's conception of class in capitalist society. The bourgeoisie are defined by their relationship to the means of production. They own the means of production as private property. So they own the factories, they own the raw materials, they own and purchase the labor of the proletariat. The proletariat, and this is key, do not own the means of production. They are forced to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie in order to survive. Now, it's actually incredibly oversimplified to say that there are only two classes in the Marxist analysis. Marx actually mentions a few other sort of nuances there too. One of them is the petty bourgeoisie, and this is what Marx has to say about the petty bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeoisie has been formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of competition, and as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. A simple way to think of the petty bourgeoisie is that they have temporary control over the means of production, however, they don't own the means of production directly. And that as a result of competition in the market, mostly competition coming from the bourgeoisie, they are continuously being sort of moving down to the proletariat and back up to petty bourgeoisie as their relationship to the means of production change. So think of, a small business owner or sort of the managerial class, when the small business goes out of business and they're forced to, again, join the working class and sell their labor to survive and so forth. And even, really when they own a small business, they usually don't own the business itself, right? Usually the bank or the financiers or the investors and so forth actually own the business. So they have temporary control over the means of production, but they very rarely own it themselves. It's the bourgeoisie that own the means of production. And the petty bourgeoisie are really the conservative sort of managerial kind of middle class. Now, conservative not in the sort of sense of what the Republican Party has become in the United States, but conservative in that their survival relies on society to not progress. So in order for them to survive, society must not progress past its current point. Now, the reason for that is the bourgeoisie have an inherent interest in continuing competition and continuously revolutionizing the means of production and the mode of production. So competition is ever increasing. So if society progresses, this never-ending competition from the bourgeoisie will essentially drive the petty bourgeoisie completely out of business. So they are conservative politically in that they don't want society to progress. Now, in modern times, this narrative has somewhat shifted where, the narrative is oftentimes that the enemy of the middle class, the enemy of sort of the managers and the small business owners is somehow the working class, in this case, the proletariat. But, Marxists would argue that, just as one modern example, modern massive corporation like Walmart has done more to damage the middle class than any movement or minimum wage, etc., coming from the working class could ever possibly do. So, Walmart has done more to damage small business owners than, a minimum wage policy or any kind of movement by the workers. Then finally, Marx talks about the Lumpin proletariat, and this is what he has to say there. The dangerous class, lumpenproletariat, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society, may here and there be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. The lumpenproletariat for Marx is a group of society that is sort of a remnant of the old way of doing things, the old mode of production, that as a result hasn't really inserted itself into the new mode of production. In this case, we're talking about capitalist society. And as a result, they actually don't have a relationship to production or the mode or means of production. They exist sort of outside of the class system. It's worth noting just sort of an interesting, observation on this term lumpenproletariat. In English, we have terms to sort of what encapsulate, bourgeoisie, right? We say the wealthy elite or business owners or the capitalists and so forth. And we have words that kind of encapsulate what the proletariat means, right? We often refer to the proletariat as the working class or the lower class or workers and so forth. But it's interesting, sort of the power dynamics inherent in the fact that there is no English word that fully encapsulates what Marx is getting at when he discusses the lumpenproletariat. We kind of can get close. We can say like the riffraff or sort of the vagabonds, kind of the untouchables. But there's no English word that really means what Marx is getting at when he says the lumpenproletariat. Now, the reason that's interesting is like I said, the power dynamics at play where there's not even a word for these people in the English language. So for Marx, the bourgeoisie own and control the means of production. The proletariat do not own the means of production or control them. They are forced to sell their labor to survive, and the bourgeoisie are the purchasers of that labor. The labor for them becomes their property through this purchase. The petty bourgeoisie have temporary control over the means of production. These are managers and small business owners and so forth. And the lumpenproletariat exists completely outside of the class structure overall. Now, what's interesting to note here in Marx's analysis of capitalism is that the interests of these classes contradict one another, specifically the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The interest of the bourgeoisie is to maximize their profit. It's to control the means of production in such a way that maximize, obviously, their financial benefit. It maximizes their profit. Now, the proletariat's interest here is to sell their labor for as much as absolutely possible, right? They must resort to selling their labor to survive in the capitalist market. So, of course, their interest, obviously, is to sell that for as much as possible. Well, we can see here how these interests contradict one another, right? Selling labor for as much as possible directly flies in the face of the bourgeoisie's interests in maximizing their profit. And the bourgeoisie's interest in maximizing their profit directly flies in the face of the proletariat wanting to sell their labor for as much as absolutely possible. Very clearly, it's business 101 that the bourgeoisie want to purchase labor for as cheaply as absolutely possible. And this is the inherent contradiction in the capitalist system, according to Marx, that will lead to its downfall and eventually revolution into the next mode of production.